Hi, my name is Rachel Whittam and welcome to my computer. I wanted to give you guys a brief tutorial in the anatomy of a scientific paper that's published in the public health or medical literature and go over a few tips on how to approach it. I grabbed this paper from the American Journal of Epidemiology. It's the relationship between obesity and exposure to light at night. This was a study conducted by researchers who were curious as to whether people that were exposed to more light at night were more likely to be obese. So I'm just going to go through the parts of the paper and then I'll tell you about how I personally read papers when I'm looking up stuff in the literature. So the first part of the paper that you'll see after you see the title and the authors is the abstract. That's right here. And the abstract contains all of the main points of the paper. It usually contains a sentence or two about their hypothesis or the background of the problem, a sentence or two about the methods, the highlights of the results, and some conclusions. And this is exactly what you'll find if you look up a paper in PubMed. You know, if you go over here, let's see, right here. If you look up a paper in PubMed, there's the abstract, and it's word for word the same. So let's click back over here to the paper. The first part of the paper is the introduction, and in public health and medical literature, introductions tend to be rather short, especially if you're used to reading psychology or sociology papers. They're actually quite short. You can see here that the introduction for this paper is really, I'd say, less than a half of a page. It's just going to hit the major highlights, and typically the authors expect that if you want to know more, you'll go look up these papers yourself. So you'll see that there'll be a sentence with a whole bunch of citations after it, rather than going through and explaining what each of those individual papers found. So the introduction starts out very broadly. Here they're talking about how the prevalence of obesity in developed societies has been increasing and that it's a very important global public health issue. As you can see, that's a very broad statement. And as they go through paragraph by paragraph, they get more and more focused on the problem that they're interested in exploring. So this issue of how light at night might relate to obesity. And they review some of the previous studies that may have suggested that there was an association. At the end of introductions, usually in the final 2 or 3 sentences, we get a sense of what their hypothesis is and a general sense of how they're going to study it. So here they say, thus, disruption of sleep and circadian rhythms might be one mechanism contributing to the worldwide rise in obesity and metabolic syndrome. That's their hypothesis. We therefore examined the association between light at night exposure and obesity in data from over 100,000 women in a large United Kingdom cohort study. So you're getting a lot of information there in that just last sentence about what they did, that it's 100,000 women, that it was in the United Kingdom, that the original study, that the original data set that they're using, it was a cohort study. So you're getting quite a bit of information about what they're about to do, even at the very end of the introduction. The next section of the paper is the methods section, and this is often divided into a bunch of different subsections. Here they're talking about the participants, who they were. Here there's a section on variables. This is usually where they talk about how they measured various things, such as BMI, waist to hip ratio, how they might have categorized different levels of light at night. Here we see that. So if you're sort of wondering these things, how did they measure light at night? You should go back to the methods section and find it. And then finally they talk about the statistical analyses that they do, and they talk about the methods. Often they'll mention what statistical software they used, stuff like that. The next section is the results section, and this is text where they're describing what they found. There's no discussion about it, it's just stated in objective terms what they found. And results sections are closely tied to the tables and figures. So every table and figure that comes up should be mentioned in the results section, though not everything that's in the tables and figures is necessarily mentioned in the results section. The text of the results section is usually pretty succinct, and if you want a little bit more information in detail, you're going to have to go to the tables and figures usually to find that. After the results section is the discussion section, and discussion sections usually have several parts. Usually the first paragraph of a discussion is summarizing the main findings from the results, and also the main findings that the authors think are most important. So sometimes a lot of stuff will be thrown at you in the results section and in the tables. If you want to know what is most important and what the authors think is most important, go to the first paragraph of the discussion section. So here they say, in this analysis of over 113,000 United Kingdom women, BMI, waist-hip ratio, and waist-hip to height ratio and waist circumference increased with increasing lightness of the room slept in at night. So that's sort of very simple language as to what the main gist of their findings were. Kind of the same sort of sentence that you might find in an abstract. If we keep scrolling down through the discussion section, the next part of the discussion is usually talking about how these findings relate to previous literature. And in this way, discussion sections are often really tied to introductions. So while the introduction lays out what research has been done previously, the discussion will go on to discuss how this relates, how this agrees or disagrees with previous findings. So if we keep scrolling down through the discussion, the next part that we typically see in discussions are a discussion of the strengths and limitations of the paper. And most important is actually the limitations. And here it is in this paper. This is where we're going to see the authors talk about things that they're a little bit concerned about and might be threats to validity. So they mention that the variable that they used to estimate late at night exposure had not yet been validated. They're going to talk about a little bit of some confounding issues that might be coming into play. And then they're also going to talk about how they tried to deal with these issues, acknowledging that it might not have entirely negated the possibility that these things are leading them to come to an incorrect conclusion. So it's really important to look at these limitations and see if you agree with them and see if there's any other concerns that you might have that they didn't bring up. At the end of the discussion, there's usually a statement of conclusion, and sometimes authors talk about what they think might be directions for future research, what kind of clinical or public health implications the papers have, or some future hypotheses that they think that this work triggers. After that, the text of the paper is over and you can see the acknowledgments. Sometimes it's nice to look and see if there's any conflicts of interest that the authors declared. It's always interesting to see who's funding what work and where the investigators were located at the time. And then at the very end is all of the references. So now we're at the very end of the PDF. I want to go back and mention, like I said, this is sort of the very general framework that you'll see for all public health and medical papers. They really have a very similar layout, and just sort of understanding this anatomy will really help you dissect papers when you're diving in. Something that not all journals do, but American Journal of Epidemiology does, which is quite nice, is at the very beginning they have all of the abbreviations that'll appear throughout the paper. So if you forget what WHR stands for, you don't have to scroll around and try to find where the first time it was mentioned. You can always go back to the very beginning and see that WHR is waist-hip ratio. So that's a really nice thing. Also, they make a note here that there's an invited commentary that accompanied this article. So sometimes if there's an especially provocative topic, the editors of a journal will invite someone to write a full commentary piece on the findings, and that was the case here. So this would also be something that might be very interesting to look up if you were doing research in this area, to see what someone else's perspective was on this new work. Now, what do I do when I'm reading a paper? Well, of course, the first thing I do is I read the abstract. And that's how I decide whether I want to read further and download it and explore it more. When I do, the next thing I go to usually is I go to that first paragraph of the discussion, because that's often such a nice summary of what the main findings were. It's a little bit more in depth than what you can find in the abstract. And then after that, I like to look at tables and figures. I much prefer digesting this kind of information in a more visual way than trying to wade through texts. like I said, this information is going to be summarized in the results section, but usually there's a little bit more detail in the tables and figures. Now, a really good table and figure should stand alone. So you should be able to look at the table and basically know what's going on without having to read the text of the article. So these authors did a very good job. They have a really nice table title here. There's all sorts of footnotes that'll help orient you to what measures were, how the measures were defined, what some of these things mean, maybe what's significant. And they continue to do that throughout. Here's another nice table with really helpful footnotes. So that's usually the second thing that I look at. I'll also say that as I'm reading the tables, I often have to go back into the methods section to get additional context for what's going on. Say I'm curious about how they measured sleeping pattern, or where are these odds ratios coming from? What kind of analysis did they do to get those odds ratios? You can get more detail from the methods section. Oh, I see here they use multinomial logistic regression. That's where the odds ratios came from. After I've finished digesting the tables, I might go through the results a little bit more just to make sure that I didn't miss anything and that I was interpreting the tables correctly. Just reading through that text is helpful. After that, I probably will go back to the beginning and read the introduction. That way I can learn about the background of the problem and how the authors are framing it. And then finally, like I said, introductions connect with discussions. I'll go back down to the discussion and start reading where I left off. As I mentioned, the first paragraph is usually where I start. At this point, I'll usually get into the second, third, fourth paragraphs of the discussion where they're tying their results back to the introduction, putting what they've found into context. And I'll also very critically and carefully read their limitations section and see what I think of it. Sometimes there's additional limitations that you might think of that the authors didn't mention. You also want to see how they dealt with each limitation. So when they mention a limitation, you should critically examine if you think they did a good job of dealing with it. And if they didn't do a good job of dealing with it, because of course we can't do a good job of dealing with everything, you want to make a decision for yourself how much you think that could possibly affect the results they found. And then I'll finish off the discussion and learn a bit more about what the authors think the next steps are, or what the public health implications for their research might be. So that's how I read a paper. Hopefully this was helpful for you, and thank you for coming to visit my computer.